All right, in this video, we're gonna tackle the rear forelink of the car. I'll explain some of the processes, some of the philosophies, and a couple of cool things that I'm trying out on it. So watch and enjoy. Johnny joints have been extricated from the Jeep. I had one Johnny joint. These are the forged Johnny joints. I actually got off of Tony Pellegrino's old race car when they did a swap meet probably 8 years ago. They've been really good. They last a long time. Been really happy with them. But one of them, the actual shank was bent, so I put that in the scrap bin, well, in the spare pile. Maybe I'll build a tire carrier or something non-critical out of it someday. And then one of them is actually stuck in the arm still, so I'm gonna have to torch that out if I want to save it. So basically, out of 6 joints, I've got 4 that are good, which is what I need for now, so I'm gonna leave it at that. But cleaned them up, scrubbed them real good, just because they'd been covered in grease and goo and stuff for all these years. And I'm now using the press, socket, gonna get the snap rings out, and I have new bushing kits for these, so they'll go into the car fresh. Snap ring out, Johnny joint apart. These have a lot of trail miles on them, and they look quite good. There's a little bit of poly dust in there. Not a lot of grease. They've obviously been a little bit dry, but I find that it's just darn near impossible to get these things where the grease collar actually lines up with the Zert. You get them in perfect, you grease them, and then after they're in the car, it just seems like you can't get grease in them. But honestly, this is pretty impressive. I could have kept running these, but we'll slap new bushings in, clean it up real good, and move on to the next. 4 bottom Johnny joints rebuilt. Took an incredibly long time, but they were all actually in good shape. So the rebuilds went nice and smooth. So basically what I do from there is I'd already laid out my brackets, at least for the lowers where I wanted them to be. The uppers, I actually moved 1/2 inch inboard on either side. Basically, I was just nervous about the tire getting into them. So it's a little bit wider than it used to be, but a little bit narrower than I had it. So I think I split the difference. I think it's gonna work fine. Lowers here, basically I centered the axle up. You don't have to center it that critically, to be honest, because as long as your brackets are all in the right place and you cut your tubes to the right length, that'll help you center it up. That's the beauty of triangulation. But the link tube is 30 inches. So the overall link's gonna be, probably somewhere around 35 or 36 inches. And I think based on where I wanted to put the front axle, I think this is gonna put the wheelbase in the ballpark of 114 inches. So now to cut the other link, drill 2 1/4 inch rosette holes in it. I don't put very big rosette holes because I find that they warp the tube bungs. In fact, I don't even really like doing the rosettes, but I'll do it with lots of anti-seize and the joints in there. Weld the rosette, then take the joint out is the plan. So I'm gonna go cut the other one and we'll see what it looks like. For link, here's the vision. So what we have is a lower triangulated 4-link. The uppers are gonna be just about straight. But in all actuality, what we have is the lowers triangulated into the chassis. The uppers are essentially dead straight, but they're actually a 1/4 inch further out on the chassis, which I realize is splitting hairs here, but it's essentially triangulating it in the other direction. Obviously, it's an infinitesimal amount, but I didn't want multiple links going in, so I aired out a little bit, and I think that'll be good. So here you can get a feel for the separation vertically on the axle and the chassis. And basically some of the goals with the project are I wanted longer rear links because I'm trying to get more travel. So the longer the link, the more you can have sweep with good drive shaft angle and the axle's not trying to wrap onto the car. And I wanted to get more aggressive on some numbers such as anti-squat. So the anti-squat's going lower than what I had in the Jeep. So in the Jeep, I had it at like 72% anti-squat, I believe, if I remember right. This one, we're aiming more at the 45 to 50%. And again, flatter links are a big part of it. Right now, the axle's up above ride height. You can see the links are nearly flat, but actually facing up a little bit. So everything will be down a little bit at actual ride height. And that is a mock-up link there. That's actually going to end up being a trailing arm. And there's lots of ways to do trailing arms when you have a laser cutter and lots of fancy parts, which I don't have. So I'm going to try and make my own out of tubing, and you can follow along with that process. Here's some of the trailing arm logic here. So with the trailing arm, if you're not going to use some kind of weird anti-wobble joint, which are expensive and I don't want to use them, basically what you need to do is you need to get the shock mount eyelet below center line of the link. If you keep it below center line, then the link's not trying to wobble out and does not break your shock eyes. So I know that I want a 32-inch long link, and it just so happens that the outer holes on my table are 32 inches, but if not, I was just going to clamp these down at 32 inches. So went ahead and bolted them through the holes at 32 inches. So there's my two heims. Now, according to some math, if I want 22 inches of travel, which might be a little optimistic, we're going to find out, but I think that lets me bump, strap, and cycle 20 inches. That would be pretty cool. With that said, I want the bypass shock, which is the rear shock, 12 inches from the bolt of the rear heim. So that's the rear heim. This line here is 12 inches, and this line marked on this mock-up tube is lined up with that. Now, based on the shock spacing, I want my two shock bolts 4 3/4 inches apart. That's going to keep my shocks real close together so that they're cycling on a similar plane. And again, because I'm using 14-inch travel for both the coilover and bypass, which is not really the right way to do it, I want to get those as close as I can. So I think that's going to work fine. So 4 3/4, I cut that in half. I marked, theoretically, here's a shock eye here. Here's a shock eye here. This tube is 7 inches. So 7 inches is going to be my low spot of the trailing arm. And then I'm going to cut a tube, run it this way, up, cut a tube, run it up that way to the heim. What this does is I can mount the shocks off of here at below center line of the link. And to do this, I used my angle finder that shows me this line here is 9 degrees. This one's going to be steeper. Let's call that 15 degrees. I'm going to split that. So for this 9 degrees, I'm going to put approximately 4.5 degrees in my chop saw so that when I go with the thick tubing, I make that very slight angled cut. Then when I come lay the tubes over here, I flip them on top, or flip one around so that it doubles that notch. I'll measure where I need to be here, and then you'll weld, and then I'm going to do some plate work to tie the whole thing together and mount the shocks. And I've never seen a trailing arm done this way. I think it's going to be strong enough, and critically, because these are upper trailing arms, they're not going to be hitting rocks on the ground. So we're going to find out how it works. But basically, this is not going to cost me any more money than just building a regular 2-inch quarter wall DOM link and some plate to reinforce it. So we'll see what happens. Cut number 1, looking good. So basically, I had my 12 degrees, used my angle finder, need to turn off, and did 6 degrees, and then I marked a line across where the cut was, which gave me a quick reference for, you can see the line faded, but the numbers are up. I had 6 and 6 for 6 degrees each side. Was up at the top, so I was able to roll that under, and that help you get your bearings pretty easily. Over here, this is our mock-up tube. Again, it's the 7 inches I wanted, so I marked the end here and marked that, and I realized that is not 15-15. That's not how I did it before, so I do that now. I want 7.5, 7.5. Now, I'll be the first to say chop saws are not wildly precise. When they cut, there's some deflection, but basically you can rotate the tube a little bit more if you need to. And then I set my angle finder exactly into the joint. Obviously I'm holding it here, but basically I'll do the same at 15 degrees over here, and that'll help me get lined up. So I drew a line just to get the direction of the bend, because if I accidentally cut it like this, then we're starting over. But flap wheeled a nice bevel in this, put a few tacks on it so that it's got its shape. And then the idea is once this side is made, this tube's a little bit long. Actually, it's quite a bit long, but it's pretty close here. I suspect I'll take, 1/4 inch here, get here, and then basically sneak up on it to where I can get it into these weld bungs and keep the heims bolted. I went ahead and welded them up, which is ill-advised because I have not cycled the suspension yet, but I'm relatively confident, and I did not want to lose my, again, 12 degree and 15 degree angles. So had a nice bevel, welded them good and hot. I'm pretty confident that, especially with the plating going across for the shocks, that we're going to be just fine on this.
What is this, Dad?
Ta-da! It fits. Now, I think I'm going to make the other one of these before I actually weld this, and I'll drill a small rosette hole, which again I've never decided on, but I'm gonna do it. It's easier to make another one of these before I weld that, because I can fit them in the exact same jig without taking the other heims apart. All right, here's an illustration of center line of each bolt and how below I can be. And keep in mind the shock, basically from the, let's try this way. These are inches. So from the bottom of the shock to the center of the eyelet hole, it needs an inch. Focus in a little bit. It needs an inch. So this could theoretically be center line of the bolt. And that's about 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch below center line. Again, tape delineating center line. So I would probably come up 1/4 inch, so I got a little bit of margin when I'm drilling my holes. Oh, whatever, you get the idea. I'm below center line, and I have a little bit of margin to stay below center line and not ramrod my bottom of the shock bodies into the top of the tube here. 2 bungs tacked on either end. Identical twin over there, and here's an idea of what we're working with. So made 2 of these plates. I have to make 2 more for the other side. This is 1/8 inch. Theoretically it'd be nice if this was bigger, but I have some strap that's going to wrap here, close the ends, and I have weld washers here, and then I'm going to make a secondary plate that reinforces this a little bit. But basically what this is doing is it's capturing the welds, it's getting the shocks mounted, and when I run my string line, these are below center line. So the whole bolt is actually below the center line, or what would be the edge of the tape. So these should flow well, they look nice, and just a lot more fiddling to make more of it. So using this, basically just space whatever you got that makes 1.5 inches, because that's the mounting width that you need. So I'm gonna make more of these plates, then I can tack, and then start working on the reinforcement plates. All right, it is very late at night, but what we have here is a trailing arm. Obviously both ends tacked, but this is 1/4 inch, 1.5 inch flat strap that I had, and I bent in that bender there, but you could always clamp it on the edge of a table, heat it up and bend it. Basically put a little over a 90 in there, and it's tight with whether the shock will rub this or not, but according to my math. So I think I'll add some plate here, but I do want to get a shock in there and cycle it, because depending on the angle the shock's aiming, you know, it may want a real low height here, but something will happen to close this off. But for now, this gives you an idea what it's going to. It is very late at night, so it's time to call it. But there's our trailing arm. Here's a 14 inch travel, 2.5 inch bodied Fox coilover, which is not the right coilover, nor the right diameter, nor in the right location, but it's pretty satisfying. And then there were two trailing arms. No, they're not done, but not a whole bunch I'm gonna add to them. Once I get the shock eyes in there, again, I'll plate these end, and then I think I'm gonna make a little strap gusset on the bottom of each weld just to help it from pulling. So they're pretty close. That's mostly what they're gonna look like. But now we get to move on to upper shock mounts. So basically what I have here is I have the Jeep at what I believe is gonna be full bump. And basically what that gives me is approximately 10 inches of up travel from ride height. Could I have gotten more? Yes, but then you start dealing with belly height. So my rough math is at full bump where it sits right now, the back of the car would be 10 inches off the ground. Now the front's not going to have as much travel, so theoretically the car will wedge down where the back of the cow will be lower than the front, which is pretty typical, I think, and I'm fine with that. And theoretically, if you bottom the car out, you know, you've got kind of a slippery wedge going on the bottom, so I think that's going to be nice. So this is full bump, drive shaft angles there, perfectly happy. So this is a trick that I like for doing shock mounts. Basically, this is 1.5 inch square tube. It's thin, and the rustier the better. But I drill a hole there, and then my shock eyes, bottomed out, are 24 inches. So bottom hole, top hole, 24 inches. The additional hole here at the top, I'm pointing with my finger and with the phone, which means you can't see anything. That's 24 3/4. Don't mind that the holes aren't perfectly center. It's not really relevant because I'll drill, when I make the top mounts, they're gonna have the same bolt spacing as the bottom. I forget what that number is, but it's written down. So that'll just cockeye my little alignment pipe just a little bit, no big deal. Anyway, so that's 24 3/4, and the reasoning for that is again, I'm running the same length coilover and bypass. So the bypass shock is gonna be rearward. That's the one that needs to bottom out and fully droop. That's one that's important. The front coilover is not gonna travel as far as a leverage ratio. So what I did is add 3/4 of an inch to the length so that I can line this up and build this shock mount to where when the bypass is bottomed out, the coilover still has 3/4 of an inch of shock shaft. And then when I get to full droop, theoretically, when the bypass is at full droop, the coilover will be closer to full droop than it otherwise would have been, but there will still be a little bit of shaft where it's not at full droop. But basically that 3/4 of an inch splits the difference, which I think will make the upper shock mount look a little better, and is just nice because the coilover will be basically never at risk of full bottoming out and never at risk of full drooping out. So that was the logic there. So now I'll cram this thing in and start figuring out what I want my upper shock mount to look like. Some cardboard aided drafting here coming along. So I think I like the look of this. I've got both my bolt holes mounted. I've got just enough meat. The coilover is going to be real close. You can see basically this front one's going to be where the coilover is. Be real close to this rear bar. Bypass there, all of it should be neat and tidy. Now for the miserable job of making not one, but 4 of these identical plates out of 3/16 to the platform. From cardboard to metal, what I did is use my template, cut the first one, got it to a decent shape, and then use that as the template for all the others, because the cardboard gets soft with paint markers after a while. So, and then I used the first plate to mark the holes for the others, so they were all drilled perfect to where that's a 1/2 inch drilled hole. The 1/2 inch bolts fit right through it. So now I will flap wheel the edges of these to get them just a little more uniform in some of the key dimensions, and that'll make 4 identicals. This is now a bit rough, but it's going to stay that way because when these get mounted to the tube, they're not going to be mounted straight up and down. They're going to cock a little bit because the shocks are going to be inboarded further than the trailing arms are. So trying to leave enough meat on here to where theoretically the insides are going to get coped a little bit deeper. So see how that works out. Number 1, so we have our 2 matching plates. This is 1.5" 3/16 flat bar that I bent using my table bender, but again, I've done the same thing in a vise. This is just a little bit faster. Tried to mimic all the bends with a slight gap down, so I have a little shelf for the weld. And measured from center line in, shocks are at a slight angle in, which I'm doing because as the tire travels up, I really don't want it to get into the shocks. So compared to where it was on my TJ, the TJ, these were spread 37.5 inches. On this, they're spread 37 inches. So they're just slightly narrower, but I like the angle that they're at with the trailing arm, which is wider on the axle than it was the TJ. So kind of splitting the difference. I think in overall stability, I'm wider on the axle. It's going to be more stable that way, but the angle hopefully helps me get the articulation out of the shocks. So we're going to have to see. It's going to be pretty far along the process before I know if I've screwed that all up. So I'll try not to weld much on this rear tube because I don't want to mess that up if I have to change it. But I also do have to make this strong enough to actually be able to cycle stuff with. So for now, going to work on the other side and then figure out where to go from there. Here, 2 pieces of square tubing, the rear one at 24, the front one at my 24 3/4, as explained earlier. I actually drilled these at 25 inches, which took me a minute to figure out why. So basically, I'm taking an inch where the coilover won't be bottomed out. It'll have an inch of shock shaft showing. I think at full droop, it's still going to be fine. I think the bypass is still going to extend before the coilover all the way does. But we'll see. Coilover and bypass are in. It's technically a little below full bump because both of them have poly bump stoppers on there. and I'm just lifting this to get jack stand notches, so don't mind that. But I actually had to go back, take this whole bracket off and cut this higher. And that happened because basically the shock body to bolt dimension on these ADSs is shorter than it was on the Foxes. So I had this bracket down quite a bit and all shaped real nice the way I liked it, but it wasn't gonna work. So I put this one on and then realized it. So cut it off, which again, luckily it was just tacked, and cut this one as it was welded together. You can see top is welded, still a little dirty. This guy's just tacked. Again, dirty as splatter spray, so I don't mind that. So this is cool. The spacing I got between the coilover and bypass looks to be just right. Now I'm gonna take the shocks back out so that I can get this back up to exactly full bump so that the axle's straight side to side, and then I'll start working on the other side. 2 shock mounts. Put a bunch of tacks on them just because they're a critical dimension that I really don't want to lose, but they're both at a good angle. I moved them a 1/4 inch further in than I thought I was going to, just because I'm really nervous about the tire getting into it, but I think that should do the job. So these will get probably like 1 1/4 1.5 inch tube that kicks from there to there, ties those in, and then there will be a tube that goes back to whatever the back half is in one way or another. But now it's time to start figuring out the gas tank, tire carrier, radiator placement, you know, basically all the stuff that I want to cram back here so I can start making the back half. All right, I think this video is going to wrap up here. 4-link is built. Shock mounts are built. Trailing arms are built. Again, everything has to be finished later, but that's the gist of it. So next is going to be digging the fuel cell out of the Jeep.